We need you.
I'm recused.
I know what you are, Imar. I filed the paperwork myself. Sit down anyway.
This is being recorded for compliance purposes. State that clearly for the record, Solange.
Recorded.
Noted. Everyone in this room understands the constraints.
What happened in there?
The committee split, 4-2. Only you can answer.
I told you I would discuss the file.
This isn't the some one name. The family's proposed a second independent director. Half the room believes he's a genuine outside appointment.
I have to do this.
Imara, wait! Don't do it!
I can't let them lie. There is a particular kind of silence that settles over a room when a family has decided, collectively and without ever voting on it, that you do not belong for 6 years. My name is Imara Whitfield.
I am a managing partner at Sterling Ashcombe Capital, where I have spent 14 years learning that the difference between a good investor and a dangerous one is patience. I did not learn that lesson at home. I learned it in boardrooms, in the hours after everyone else had gone home, reading covenants until the language stopped feeling like language and started feeling like architecture, load-bearing walls, structural weaknesses, places where a building might come down if you leaned on it wrong. My husband, Julian Calloway, comes from a different kind of architecture. His family built Calloway Manufacturing over 3 generations, out of a single garment factory in the years after the war, into a mid-sized industrial group that made precision components for furniture, appliances, and, more recently, renewable energy hardware. It was, by any reasonable measure, a good company. Disciplined, occasionally stubborn, run by people who believed that loyalty was something you inherited, not something you earned. When Julian and I married, I made a decision that I have never once regretted, though it cost me more than I expected. I told him plainly in the kitchen of his parents' house the week before our wedding that I would never advise on Calloway Manufacturing, never sit on its board, never let my professional life touch his family's company in any visible way. I did this because I understood something about myself, that if I ever mixed the two, no one would ever be able to tell where my judgment ended and my marriage began. Not them, not me. You don't have to do that, Julian said. He was standing at the counter, slicing bread for his mother, the way he always did when he wanted his hands occupied during a difficult conversation. I know I don't have to, I said. I want to. It's the only way I can be sure I'm not using you, and you're not using me. He looked at me for a long moment, and something in his face softened in a way I would only recognize years later as relief. My mother will still find a way to think you married me for the company, he said. He was right. She did. Cecilia Calloway did not dislike me in the way people dislike an enemy. She disliked me the way a gardener dislikes a plant that grew in the wrong bed, not out of malice, but out of a conviction that things belong where they are placed, and I had not been placed by her. She had raised Julian to marry someone who understood, in her words, what the family had built and what it owed to the people who built it. She did not consider financial competence a form of understanding. She considered it a substitute for it. For 6 years, I attended Sunday dinners at the Calloway House, a wide colonial with a wraparound porch where Cecilia kept her roses in obsessive, competitive bloom. I brought wine that was never quite the wine she would have chosen. I asked about the business in careful, deliberately uninformed ways, because I had learned early that any specific question about receivables, about the succession plan, about the factory expansion in Ohio, was received not as interest but as intrusion. Julian's father, Kendrick Calloway, was a different kind of difficult. He respected precision wherever he found it, and he had, over the years, begun to ask me quiet questions after dinner, when Cecilia was in the kitchen, about interest rate exposure, about how a company his size should think about debt in a rising rate environment. I answered honestly and briefly, never volunteering more than he asked, and he would nod slowly, the way a man nods when he is filing something away, rather than agreeing with it. You'd have made a good Calloway, he told me once, on the porch, in early autumn, with the kind of gruffness that in him passed for warmth. I'm already a good Whitfield, I said, and he laughed, once, sharply, like something surprised out of him. I want to be honest about something. I did not think of myself as suffering. I had a career I loved, a husband I loved, and a family that tolerated me with the particular chill of people waiting for you to prove yourself unnecessary. I told myself that was enough. I told myself that for 6 years, I could point to 100 small moments before the badge that should have told me everything, if I had let myself see them clearly. There was the family portrait taken for the company's 40th anniversary, 3 years into my marriage, in which I was asked, gently, by the photographer, to stand one step further back than everyone else, for balance. There was the year Cecilia redid the guest bedrooms and gave every daughter-in-law's room a nameplate on the door. Priscilla's, her cousin's wife's, except the room Julian and I stayed in when we visited, which remained, simply, the blue room. I noticed these things the way you notice a draft in an old house. Uncomfortable, but not yet urgent enough to investigate the source. The clearest of these moments came at an ordinary Sunday dinner, 2 years before the anniversary, when Kendrick mentioned, over dessert, that the company was considering financing options for a plant expansion and had received a preliminary term sheet from a regional bank that he found, in his words, aggressive. "What would you look for in a term sheet like that?" he asked me, directly, setting down his fork. I answered carefully, staying general. Covenant flexibility, prepayment terms, whether the pricing grid stepped down with performance. The kind of answer I would have given a stranger at a dinner party who happened to mention the same problem. Cecilia set her glass down with more precision than the gesture required. "Kendrick, I don't think we should be discussing the company's financing at the table. I only asked a general question," Kendrick said. "There's no such thing as a general question when it's answered by someone who does this for a living and married into the family that's asking," Cecilia said, and though her voice stayed pleasant, the sentence landed with the particular weight of something she had been waiting for an opening to say. "I'd rather we kept Sunday dinner as Sunday dinner." I remember agreeing with her out loud that evening, because agreeing was easier than defending a boundary I had drawn myself, for my own reasons, being used against me as though I had been the one to blur it. I remember also, driving home, feeling the particular sting of being punished for a discipline I had adopted, specifically to avoid ever being accused of overstepping. I had built a wall to protect the family from ever doubting my motives, and Cecilia had simply moved the wall 2 feet closer to me, so that even a single sentence of professional courtesy became evidence of transgression. Then came the badge. Callaway Manufacturing's headquarters occupied 4 floors of a mid-rise building downtown, glass and brushed steel, with a lobby security desk that issued visitor badges to anyone without a permanent card. I had been to that building perhaps 30 times over 6 years, for Julian's birthday lunches, for the company holiday party, for the afternoon his father had a minor cardiac scare, and I had come to sit with the family in the executive floor's private waiting room while doctors ran tests. Every single time, without exception, I was issued a temporary badge. Visitor, it said, in red block letters, with an expiration printed at the bottom, valid for 1 day only. I had never thought much about it. It was procedure. Everyone who was not an employee received the same badge. The UPS courier, the auditors from the accounting firm, me. Except that was not quite true, and I learned how untrue it was on a Tuesday in March, the week of the company's founding anniversary dinner, an event the family held every 5 years to mark the business's history. I arrived that evening in the lobby with Julian, both of us dressed for what I understood to be a formal, sentimental occasion. Toasts, old photographs, a slideshow of the original factory floor. At the security desk, the young woman behind the glass looked up my name in her system and printed, as always, a red visitor badge. Julian's cousin Priscilla, who worked in the company's marketing department and had a permanent badge clipped to her blazer, was standing nearby with a stack of printed table cards. She glanced at my badge, then at Julian's, and said, lightly, the way people say cruel things when they've rehearsed sounding casual. "Funny that after 6 years you're still visiting." I said nothing. Julian said nothing either, which I noted, the way you note a crack in a foundation before you decide whether it's cosmetic or structural. Upstairs, at the private dinner in the executive dining room, I sat at a round table with Julian, his parents, Priscilla, and 2 of the company's senior directors. Kendrick stood to give the anniversary toast, a speech about grandfathers and factory floors and the people who had given their working lives to this company. It was a good speech. I meant that. I watched him deliver it and felt, unexpectedly, moved. Then Cecilia stood, glass in hand, to add what she called a mother's addendum, and said, warmly to the room, and to the family, by blood and by marriage, who carry this forward. It should have included me. It was, on its surface, generous. But her eyes, when she said by marriage, moved not to me, but to Priscilla's husband, seated 2 tables away, a man who had joined the company's legal department 18 months earlier, and had already, in Cecilia's telling over the preceding months, understood the Callaway way of doing things, with a speed she found remarkable. I understood in that moment precisely what the sentence meant, and precisely who it excluded. Later, in the hallway outside the restroom, Cecilia found me alone, refreshing lipstick I did not need to refresh. She had had 2 glasses of wine, which in her was enough to loosen, slightly, the careful architecture of her politeness. I want to say something to you, Imara, and I want you to hear it as it's meant, not as an attack. She folded her hands. You've been a fine wife to Julian. I mean that sincerely. But you have never been, and I don't think you were ever meant to be, our daughter-in-law in the way that matters to this family. You kept yourself apart from everything we built. That was your choice, and I respected it. But you cannot keep yourself apart for 6 years and then expect, at the end of it, to be counted as one of us. Some things you have to build toward. You can't simply arrive at them. I kept myself apart, I said carefully, because I didn't want anyone in this family ever wondering whether my judgment could be bought with a wedding ring. No one asked you to buy anything, she said. We asked you to belong. Those aren't the same thing, and I think, if you're honest, you've always known that. She left before I could answer, which was, I would come to understand, exactly the kind of exit she preferred, the kind that let her have the last word by simply removing herself from the conversation. I found Julian by the elevators 20 minutes later, holding both our coats, his jaw set in the particular way it set when he had heard something and decided, again, not to address it. You heard, I said, some of it, and he was quiet for the length of the elevator ride down, all the way to the lobby, where my visitor badge sat clipped to my dress, its red letters catching the light of the chandelier above the security desk. I love you, he said finally, in the car. I don't know how to fix what my mother believes. I've been trying to figure that out for 6 years, and I don't have an answer tonight either. I'm not asking you to fix her, I said. I'm asking you to see me. I see you, he said, and reached for my hand at a red light, and I let him take it, because I did not yet know how much that answer would cost us both, or how soon I would need him to mean it, in a way that went beyond a sentence in a car. I did not cry when I got home. I want to be honest about that too, because I think there is a version of this story where the humiliated wife weeps quietly into a glass of wine, and that was not the shape of my grief. My grief took the shape of work. I sat at my desk that night, still in my dinner dress, and opened a file I had been reviewing for the firm. An unrelated mid-market industrial deal, nothing to do with the Callaways, and I read covenant language for 2 hours, until my hands stopped feeling like they belonged to someone standing in a hallway being told she did not belong. This is, I have come to believe, the closest thing I have to a discipline. When the world declines to give me a place, I build one out of competence, because competence is the one thing no one can take from you in a hallway with 2 glasses of wine in them. I did not know, that night, that within 72 hours, Callaway Manufacturing would be sitting across a conference table from my own firm, asking, not me personally, not yet, but Sterling Ashcombe Capital as an institution, to save it from a debt crisis that had been building, quietly, for over a year. I did not know that the badge in the lobby would, before the month was out, mean something entirely different than it had meant that evening. I only knew, driving home from that dinner, that something in me had gone still and clear, the way water goes still and clear right before it begins, very slowly, to freeze. The call came on a Friday morning, 3 days after the anniversary dinner, from Solange Ferris, Sterling Ashcombe's head of credit origination, a woman I had worked alongside for 9 years and trusted the way you trust someone who has never once told you what you wanted to hear, instead of what was true. We've got an inbound referral, she said, settling into the chair across from my desk with a folder she hadn't yet opened. Mid-sized industrial manufacturer, Family-owned, 3 generations. They're looking for emergency mezzanine financing, bridge facility, probably 18 to 24 months, to refinance a term loan that's coming due while they're mid-build on a new production line. Their bank pulled back after a covenant miss last quarter. It's not catastrophic, but it's tight, and it needs to move fast. Who's the company? Callaway Manufacturing. I did not say anything for a moment, and Solange, who missed very little, tilted her head. Imara. That's my husband's family's company, I said. She closed the folder without opening it. You're recused, obviously. Obviously, I agreed. I want to explain, for anyone who has not spent their career inside institutional finance, what recusal actually means in a moment like this, because it is not simply a matter of stepping out of a room. Sterling Ashcombe Capital is not a small operation. We manage capital on behalf of pension funds, endowments, and institutional investors who have entrusted us with the discipline of separating personal relationships from professional judgment. My recusal from evaluating the Callaway deal was not a courtesy. It was a fiduciary obligation, documented, formal, filed with our compliance office within the hour. But recusal from the evaluation is not the same as recusal from the outcome. I was a managing partner. I sat on the firm's investment committee, the 7-person body that approved or declined every deal above a certain size, and Callaway Manufacturing's request, once underwritten, would exceed that threshold by a wide margin. I could recuse myself from the analysis. I could not, without resigning from the committee entirely, recuse myself from the vote. Not without the firm losing a managing partner's judgment on every other deal that crossed the committee's desk for the length of the engagement, which our partnership agreement did not permit for a single conflicted transaction. What I could do, and what I did within the hour, was disclose the conflict fully, recuse myself from every stage of underwriting and negotiation, and commit to abstaining from any vote unless the full committee, unanimously, asked me to break a tie, which had happened exactly twice in the firm's history. I told Julian that evening, before he could hear it any other way. We sat in our kitchen, the lights low, the two of us at the small table by the window, rather than the larger one in the dining room we rarely used. I told him plainly, his family's company had approached my firm for emergency financing, that I was fully walled off from the deal, that I would have no part in the analysis, the terms, or the recommendation, and that the outcome would rest with colleagues who had never met a single Callaway, and never would. Julian put his head in his hands. Not out of anger, out of something closer to disbelief. The particular disbelief of a man watching 2 separate rooms of his life, kept carefully apart for years by design, collide despite every precaution. Does my mother know? He asked. I don't know what she knows. I only know what I know, and what I know is that I am not the one deciding this. But you'll know things. Before we do, you'll see the numbers. I'll see nothing, I said. I am walled off. That's not a phrase, Julian. It's a legal and structural fact. I don't have access to the file. I won't have access to the file. If I so much as ask a colleague how the underwriting is progressing, that alone would be a compliance violation serious enough to end my career. He looked at me for a long moment. Then why does it feel like the most important thing that's ever happened to us? Because it is, I said, just not for the reason you think. The following 10 days were, professionally, the strangest of my career, not because anything unusual happened to me, but because nothing did. I went to work. I closed an unrelated deal for a packaging company in Ohio. I sat in on committee meetings for other transactions and said nothing about Callaway, because there was nothing being said about Callaway in front of me. The wall held. That was the entire point of it, and I found, to my own quiet surprise, a strange comfort in watching it hold, in knowing that whatever judgment my firm reached, it would not be mine, and therefore it could not be used, by anyone, as a weapon in either direction. Julian did not have the same comfort. His family, apparently, did. He came home on a Wednesday evening, looking as though he had aged a year in an afternoon. His mother had called an emergency family meeting, he told me, after learning, not from Julian, but from the company's CFO, who had recognized my name on the recusal disclosure that Sterling Ashcombe was required to send as part of standard conflict of interest documentation, that Imara Whitfield, wife of Julian Callaway, was a managing partner at the very firm now evaluating whether to save the family business. "She thinks you did this," Julian said, sitting heavily at the kitchen table. "She thinks you orchestrated it somehow. Got your firm the referral. Positioned yourself. I've never once discussed Callaway Manufacturing's finances with anyone at my firm. Not once. In 9 years of working there. I built that wall 6 years ago, specifically so this exact accusation could never be true. I told her that." "What did she say?" Julian was quiet for a long moment. "She said it doesn't matter whether it's true. What matters is that the company's survival now runs through you, one way or another, and she can't decide whether that's the worst thing that's ever happened to this family or the only thing that might save it." I understood, hearing that, something about Cecilia I had not fully understood before. Her rejection of me had never been about me specifically. It had been about control, about the belief that a family business could only be protected by people who had been raised inside its particular loyalties, its particular obligations, its particular understanding of what was owed to whom. And now the single most consequential decision in the company's history rested with an institution she could not control, staffed partly by a woman she had spent 6 years insisting did not belong. "Kendrick wants to see you," Julian said. "Not about the deal. He said he understands you can't discuss it. He wants to see you as his son's wife." I went the following Sunday, alone, at Kendrick's specific request. He met me on the porch, among the roses Cecilia had not yet started for the season, and he did not ask me a single question about the financing. "I've built things my whole life," he said, looking out at the yard rather than at me. "Factories mostly. You learn, building things, that the foundation matters more than anything anyone ever sees on the surface. I used to think family was a kind of foundation you were simply born onto. I'm 71 years old, Imara, and I'm only now understanding that a foundation has to be built too. Poured, reinforced. It doesn't arrive finished, just because people share a name. I don't know what happens with the financing," I said. "I want to be honest with you about that. I'm not part of it. I can't be." "I know," he said. "I'm not asking about the financing. I'm asking you not to hold 6 years of my wife's stubbornness against 71 years of my own failure to correct her." He looked at me then, directly, for the first time. "Whatever happens with this company, I'd like my son's marriage to survive it. That's the only thing I came out here to say." I did not know, standing on that porch, whether the company would survive. I did not know, more importantly, whether I wanted it to. A thought that arrived with its own quiet shame, because I understood, even as I had it, that wanting a company to fail, because its matriarch had humiliated me in a hallway, was not the kind of person I had spent 14 years building myself into being. During those weeks, Julian traveled twice to the Ohio plant to review the new production line with the company's operations team, and I met him once at the airport on his way back, in the quiet corner of a lounge that smelled faintly of burnt coffee and recycled air. He looked, that evening, like a man carrying a weight that had nowhere yet to be set down. "The line's on schedule," he said, sitting beside me with his tie loosened. "That much I know. I don't know what happens with the financing. Nobody tells me anything, and I can't ask you. And it's strange, Imara. I've spent my whole life being told what this company needs from me, and for the first time I have absolutely no say in whether it survives." "That might be the healthiest position you've ever been in," I said, and he laughed, tiredly, because he understood, even exhausted, that I meant it kindly. "My father asked me something on the plane," he said. "He asked whether I thought you'd tank the deal out of spite, if you had the chance." I told him no. He said he believed me, but he wanted to hear it from me anyway. I don't think he was really asking about you. I think he was asking whether he still knew his own family well enough to trust anyone in it. I understood, hearing that, how completely the crisis had begun to reach past balance sheets and into the family's sense of itself. A company built on the belief that blood and loyalty were the same thing, discovering, under pressure, how little that belief had prepared anyone for a moment requiring judgment instead of instinct. Meanwhile, 3 floors below my office, the underwriting proceeded with the particular rhythm I knew well from the outside of 100 other deals, though never before from quite this angle. Sterling Ashcomb's investment committee was, by design, not a room of similar minds. Abina Okonkwo approached every file as though it were guilty, until the numbers proved otherwise, and her memos were famous internally for a bluntness that had saved the firm from at least 2 disasters I knew of personally. Desmond Ruark, our general counsel, cared less about whether a deal made money, and more about whether it could survive a deposition 5 years later if it went wrong. And Solange, who ran origination, had built her reputation on a rare gift for seeing a founder's or a family's real character within the first 2 meetings, which meant that when she told me, later, that the Calloway family's operating team had impressed her more than their financials had, I understood it as the highest compliment she was capable of giving. They know their factory floor better than half the CEOs I meet know their own balance sheets, she told me one evening, not as a disclosure of the deal's substance, which she was careful never to share, but as an observation she felt comfortable making about competence in the abstract. Whatever's happening in that family, Amara, somebody down there still knows how to build something real. I held on to that sentence for longer than I probably should have, in the weeks that followed, because it was the only piece of the underwriting I was ever permitted to hear, and because it told me something I had needed, without quite admitting it to myself, to be told, that the company Julian's family had built, whatever its failures of feeling, was not a company built on illusion. Whatever judgment the committee reached, it would be reaching it about something genuinely worth saving. The underwriting took 26 days. On the 27th, Solange came to my office and closed the door. "The committee's meeting Thursday," she said. "Full recommendations in. I need to tell you something, and I need you to hear it as information, not as an invitation to do anything with it. Go ahead. The deal is good, Imara. Genuinely good. The covenant miss last quarter was real, but it wasn't mismanagement. It was a timing mismatch between the Ohio plant's capital draws and a delayed customer contract. Their order book is strong, their margins are healthy, their debt to EBITDA, even stressed, comes back under 3 times within 18 months if the new line comes online on schedule, which our engineering diligence says it will. This is exactly the kind of bridge financing this firm exists to provide. I'd recommend it to any client, family-owned or not, related to you or not. Then recommend it, I said. There's a condition, standard for a family-controlled borrower this size, but the committee wants it explicit in the term sheet. Independent board oversight. A minimum of 2 outside directors with real authority, audit committee access, veto rights on related party transactions, the standard governance package we require whenever family control concentration is this high. It's not personal, it's underwriting discipline, but given who the family is, I wanted you to hear it from me before Thursday, not read it in the minutes. I sat with that for a moment. That's the right condition, I said. I'd have required the same thing for any borrower with this ownership structure. I know you would have. That's rather the point. The investment committee met on a Thursday afternoon, in a room I was by my own commitment, not permitted to enter for the substantive discussion. I sat in my office 3 floors up, reviewing an entirely unrelated term sheet for a logistics company in Tennessee, and I did not check the time, or at least I told myself I did not check the time, though I noticed, later, that I had somehow reviewed the same paragraph 4 times without absorbing a word of it. At 4:40 in the afternoon, Solange knocked on my door, and behind her stood 2 other committee members, Abena Okonkwo, our head of risk, whose skepticism had killed more bad deals than any covenant in the firm's history, and Marcus. No, not Marcus. I correct myself, because names matter, and the man behind Solange was Desmond Ruark, our general counsel, who did not attend committee meetings for deals unless something required his direct sign-off. "We need you," Solange said. "I'm recused." The committee split 4-2, with 1 abstention pending your input on a single, narrow question, not the deal itself. Governance structure. The proposed independent directors include a name the family has floated, and half the committee believes it's a genuine outside appointment, and half believes it's a family loyalist dressed as an independent. We need someone who understands this family's internal structure well enough to tell us whether the proposed director is actually independent, in substance, not just on paper. You are, whether anyone likes it or not, the only person at this firm with that knowledge. We are asking you, formally, with Desmond present, to document that this is a narrow, single-question consultation, and not a re-entry into the broader deal evaluation, whether you're willing to answer one factual question under those constraints. I looked at Desmond. Document it precisely, I said. I answer one factual question about one individual's actual independence from family control, and nothing else. I don't see terms, I don't see pricing, I don't see the credit memo. Agreed and noted, Desmond said. The proposed director's name was Priscilla's husband, the same man Cecilia had, at the anniversary dinner, praised for understanding the Callaway way of doing things with remarkable speed. He is not independent, I said. He's family by marriage, he reports informally, directly to Cecilia Callaway on matters of family sentiment, and he has been employed by the company for 18 months in a role his father-in-law created for him. He would not survive 5 minutes of genuine scrutiny as an outside director, and I would say that about him regardless of who was asking, or why. Solange nodded slowly. That's what Abina thought. Thank you. She hesitated at the door. For what it's worth, Imara, the committee isn't going to ask you anything else. This was the last question. Whatever happens Thursday evening, it happens without you in the room. Before the committee's final vote, the family had gone through their own version of the same reckoning, in a conference room at their outside counsel's office downtown. A room I never entered, but one Julian described to me afterward in enough detail that I could picture it clearly. A long walnut table, the Callaway family's attorney of 30 years at the head, Kendrick and Cecilia on one side, Julian and Priscilla across from them, and a term sheet, still marked preliminary and confidential, open in front of everyone. Cecilia had asked, according to Julian, whether the independent director requirement could be negotiated down, whether the firm might accept one outside director instead of two, given the family's history and its standing with its bank of 30 years. The attorney had explained, patiently, that the requirement was not unusual for a facility of this size and ownership concentration, and that pushing back on it was unlikely to succeed, and more likely to slow the closing at a moment when speed mattered more than pride. She asked one more question after that, Julian told me. She asked the attorney, directly, whether he thought the firm's underwriting team had been fair to us, given who they now knew was married into the family. He told her he had reviewed the credit memo himself, and there was nothing in it, not the pricing, not the covenants, not the governance conditions, that he wouldn't have expected from any lender evaluating a company with this ownership structure. He said, and I remember this exactly, that if anything, the terms were slightly better than he'd have predicted for a mid-sized family manufacturer in this rate environment. My mother went quiet after that, Julian said. Not defeated, just quiet, in the way people go quiet when a belief they have held for a long time turns out to rest on less than they assumed. The committee approved the financing that evening, on terms that were, by any objective measure, generous to Callaway Manufacturing and rigorous in their governance requirements. An 18-month bridge facility, priced fairly, contingent on the appointment of 2 genuinely independent directors, with real authority over related party dealings, audit oversight, and a formal, binding limit on family compensation draws for the duration of the facility. Priscilla's husband's name did not appear anywhere in the final term sheet. I learned this the way I learned everything about the deal from that point forward. Second-hand, through Julian, who received the term sheet from his father, with visible relief and no understanding, yet, of how close it had come to including a condition that would have quietly protected the very dynamics that had helped create the crisis in the first place. The family learned eventually the shape of what had happened, not because I told them, and not because the firm disclosed internal committee deliberations, which it never does, but because Kendrick, methodical as ever, asked Sterling Ashcomb's relationship manager directly, in a follow-up meeting, why the family's proposed independent director had been rejected. The relationship manager, bound by confidentiality regarding internal committee process, but not regarding the substance of the governance requirement, explained plainly that the individual did not meet the objective test for independence under the firm's underwriting standards, family relation by marriage, employment created specifically for him, reporting lines that ran, in practice, through the matriarch rather than the board. Kendrick did not need anyone to draw him a diagram. He came to our house 2 days later, without calling first, and found me in the garden, not the Callaway's garden, but the small one behind our own house, where I grew nothing so ambitious as roses. I know it was you, he said. The independence question. I know the firm won't tell me, and I'm not asking you to confirm it. I just want you to know that I know, and that I understand what it means that you answered it honestly, instead of protecting my family's comfort. I would have answered it the same way about any family, Kendrick. That's the only version of the answer that means anything. I understand that now, he said. I don't think I understood it 3 weeks ago. I think, 3 weeks ago, I still believed that loyalty and honesty were the same instinct wearing different clothes. I'm old enough that I should have known better. He stood there a moment longer, in his good coat, in my small garden, and then he asked the question that I have thought about many times since, because it did not feel, when he asked it, like a performance or a test. It felt like a man genuinely wondering out loud whether the answer applied to himself as much as to me. If a family rejected you, he said, personally, completely, for years, and then that same family needed you, needed your judgment to survive, would you still help them? Honestly, not the answer you think I want to hear. I already did, I said. I didn't help you because you needed me. I helped you because the deal was sound, and telling the truth about a bad governance structure was the right thing to do regardless of whose name was on the door. Those are different reasons, Kendrick, and I think the difference matters more than anything else in this whole story. He nodded slowly, the way he nodded on the porch, filing something away. Except this time, I understood. He was not filing it away to weigh against some future use. He was simply, finally, letting it in. Julian told me weeks later about a conversation he'd had with his father in the executive office at Callaway Manufacturing, long after the rest of the floor had emptied for the evening, the two of them going through the new governance package line by line under a single desk lamp. Kendrick had stopped, Julian said, at the clause limiting family compensation draws, and sat with it for a long moment. He asked me if I thought it was fair, Julian said. I told him I thought it was overdue. He didn't argue. He just sat there for a while, and then he said something I don't think I'll forget, that he'd spent 40 years believing the hardest part of running a family company was keeping outsiders from taking what wasn't theirs, and it had taken a financial crisis to show him that the harder part was making sure the family didn't quietly take more than its share either, simply because no one was watching closely enough to say no. What did you say to that? I told him I understood because I'd spent 6 years watching my own family take you for granted in a different currency. Not money, just presence, effort. All the Sunday dinners you sat through, being polite to people who weren't polite back. Julian looked at me across the kitchen table, and there was something in his face I had waited a long time to see plainly. I told him I was done being quiet about it, not angry, just done. I did not ask him what his father said in response, because Julian's voice, telling me that part, had already answered the only question that mattered to me, not whether Kendrick approved, but whether Julian, at last, had stopped needing him to. Cecilia did not come to me. I want to be honest about that, because I think a lesser version of this story would have her arrive at my door in tears, transformed, apologizing in a single cathartic scene that resolves 6 years of accumulated hurt in an afternoon. That is not what happened, and I do not think it is what happens, honestly, in most families that carry old wounds. What happened instead was smaller and slower, and in its way more believable. She invited us to dinner, an ordinary Sunday dinner, not an anniversary, not a crisis meeting, simply dinner, the first one in 6 years, to which I had not needed to steel myself in the car beforehand. When I arrived at the house, there was no visitor badge to speak of course. It was her home, not the office. But there was, on the hall table by the door, an envelope with my name on it, in Cecilia's careful handwriting. Inside was a single card, the kind she used for thank you notes after dinner parties. And on it, in her precise hand, she had written only this: I confused belonging with agreement for a long time. I don't know how to undo 6 years in an evening, and I won't insult you by pretending I can. But I would like to try, slowly, if you'll let me. I did not cry reading it, not exactly, though something in my chest loosened in a way I recognized as relief rather than triumph. There was no version of this in which I had won something from Cecilia. There was only a version in which two people, neither of them owed an apology by the other in equal measure, decided that 6 years of careful distance had cost more than either of them wanted to keep paying. At dinner, Cecilia did not mention the financing, the badge, or the anniversary toast. She asked me, instead, an ordinary question, the kind mothers-in-law ask daughters-in-law who have always belonged, what I thought of the roses coming in early this year, given the mild winter. I told her honestly that I did not know enough about roses to have an opinion, and she laughed, a real laugh, unguarded, and said that was, at long last, something we could work on together. It was not everything. It was not, I want to be clear, an ending in the way endings are sometimes written, complete, symmetrical, wrapped. Julian and I had a long conversation that same week, difficult in its own way, about the years he had spent choosing silence over confrontation, and about what he owed me going forward that had nothing to do with his mother's evolution, and everything to do with his own courage. That conversation is its own story, and it is still, in a sense, being written. But 3 months later, when Callaway Manufacturing held its first board meeting under the new governance structure, 2 genuine independent directors seated, related party protections in place, the family's compensation draws formally limited for the duration of the facility, Kendrick asked the front desk to issue a permanent badge, not a visitor's badge, for anyone named Callaway who might one day attend a board meeting as a guest of the family. He specified, in writing, to the security office, that this included spouses. I was not required to attend a single board meeting. I never asked for the badge, and I want that understood clearly, because I think the meaning of it depends entirely on the fact that I never asked. I have it still, in a drawer at home, unused. I do not think I will ever need to use it. That is not, I have come to believe, the point of it. The point is that it exists, that somewhere in a building I have visited perhaps 40 times over 7 years, there is a badge with my name on it that does not expire at the end of the day, issued not because I demanded it, and not because a business crisis forced anyone's hand, but because a family finally understood the difference between tolerating someone's presence and recognizing their place. I think often about the question Kendrick asked me in the garden, whether I would help a family that had rejected me, simply because they needed me. I have come to believe it is the wrong question, though I understand why he asked it, and why it lingers. The right question, I think, is quieter and less dramatic. Not whether you would help people who hurt you, but whether you can separate the help you're capable of giving from the hurt you're still carrying. Whether your competence can remain honest, even when your heart has every reason not to be. I did not save Callaway Manufacturing because I loved the people who ran it. On the day the committee voted, several of them did not yet love me either. Not really, not in the way family is supposed to mean it. I helped, insofar as my narrow, single, walled-off answer to one factual question can be called help, because the alternative, shading the truth to either punish or please, would have made me someone I did not want to become, in a story that was never really about revenge at all. Ownership, I have learned, passes by inheritance. A name goes on a deed, a share certificate, a family tree, and the world calls that ownership, and it is not wrong to call it that. But respect is not inherited. It is not printed on a certificate or clipped to a lanyard at a security desk. It is built, slowly, the way Kendrick built his factories, poured, reinforced, tested under weight before anyone is allowed to trust it. I spent 6 years believing I had done everything required to earn my place in that family, and I had done a great deal, but I had not done the one thing that mattered most, which was simply to keep showing up, honestly, even when no one was applauding it, to let my competence speak without needing anyone's permission to be heard. The visitor badge sits in my drawer, and beside it, now, sits the permanent one Kendrick issued. I keep them together on purpose, not as a trophy, and not as a wound, as a reminder that the distance between them was never about paperwork. It was about years, the ones I spent proving something to people who were not yet ready to see it, and the ones still ahead, in which Cecilia and I are only just beginning to learn what it means to belong to each other on purpose, rather than by accident of marriage or emergency of circumstance. If someone you loved needed your judgment after years of denying you their respect, would you still give it honestly? I did. I would again, not because it earned me anything, though, In time, it did, but because the version of myself who could do it anyway was the only version I ever wanted to be. I think too about what it would have cost me to answer differently. It would have been easy, in the narrow moment when the committee asked me one factual question, to shade the truth slightly, to call a loyalist independent enough, to spare a family that had never once spared me the full weight of scrutiny. No one outside that room would ever have known. I would have told myself, afterward, that I had simply given people I loved the benefit of the doubt. But I have watched enough deals go wrong to know that benefit of the doubt, extended to the wrong person at the wrong moment, is very often just cowardice, wearing a kinder name. I would have known. That would have been enough to cost me something no apology could have returned. I have also come to believe that the family's crisis and my own were never really two separate stories, however much they looked that way at the start. A company that cannot tell the difference between loyalty and truth will eventually find itself unable to tell the difference between a sound decision and a comfortable one. And a family that measures belonging by bloodline alone will eventually discover that bloodline builds nothing on its own. Callaway Manufacturing did not survive because I was clever, or because I was patient, or even because I was, in the end, forgiving. It survived because it had always been a fundamentally sound business, run by people capable of real competence. Once the family finally allowed competence, anyone's, including mine, to be judged honestly rather than filtered through the question of whose name it belonged to. I do not know what would have happened if the underwriting had gone the other way, if the numbers had told a harder story. I have asked myself that question more than once, late at night, the way you turn over a decision you never actually had to make. I would like to believe I would have delivered that answer with the same steadiness. I think I would have. I think that is, in the end, the only kind of help worth giving anyone. The kind that would have been offered exactly the same way, whether or not it was ever going to be thanked.